to his father one day and he says, "Dad, where do all the people in the world come from? Where did they come from?" And the father says, "Well, son," he said, "God created two people. He created Adam and Eve, and then all the people on the earth came from just those two people." "Oh, okay, thanks, Dad." So he goes to his mother and he says, "Mom, where did all the people in the world come from?" And she says, "Well," she says, "billions of years ago there was all these things happening, and a long time ago somehow this life came up in a swamp, and then everything came up, and so all the people ended up coming from monkeys. So everybody here is related to monkeys." "Oh, thanks, Mom." So he goes back to his father and he says, "Dad, Mom said to me that all the people in the world come from monkeys, and you said that God made two people." He says, "Well, your mother's absolutely right. Her side of the family did come from monkeys, but we came from God on our side." Everything slides on here, so if you guys have a problem seeing any of it, you might want to move over there. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I look forward to this. Before I start, I'd like to just have a quick prayer myself. Our gracious Father, we just thank you for this opportunity. I thank you for the time that we can have here, and I thank you that you are with me, that you can help me with the words that I need, that we can try to make some things clear to people. Father, we just thank you for this time in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Before I start, I want to tell you who I am. Who am I? And what right do I have to be able to talk to you about creation and evolution? My name is Ted Walczak. I was born in Ontario. My father was from Poland, my mother was from Canada.
Can I turn these on?
Sure. So the situation was that my father was Roman Catholic and my mother was Protestant. I was told as a youngster that I had to go to church with one or the other. So I went with my father a couple of times, and back in the 1950s, the Roman Catholic Church did everything in Latin. And of course, my father having come from Poland, it was a Polish Roman Catholic Church, and so when they were not in Latin, they were talking Polish. And of course, I was wrong. So that lasted a couple of weeks, and I said, "No, I don't need that." So I went with my mother. In the United Church that we were going to, when I was in high school, they said, "Don't believe the Bible. The Bible's not true in the Old Testament. We know that man came about through evolution, and we know all of these things, and that's all a fact now, so don't believe the Bible." And I can remember as a teenager saying, "Where does it say in the Bible that?" We never really read the Bible, but I mean, I would flip through it, and I said, "Where does it say don't believe here, but believe here?" And so I finally said, if I can't believe the old part, why should I believe the new? So I walked away. When I left high school and went off to university, I never looked at church again. Never. In university, I studied to be a mechanical engineer. I graduated and I went on into studying nuclear engineering. I worked in a master's degree. After a year and a half on my master's degree, my professor wanted me to say some things to the Atomic Energy of Canada that I felt was a lie, because he wanted me to he wanted more money to do the research. And I said, "I've done this experiment once, and I can't justify what you want me to say." "Well, yeah, if we do this and we do this and say that and do that, we can do this. We can get money." I said, "Well, you can, but I can't." And I walked away, so I never completed my master's degree in nuclear engineering. I went on from there, got married, wonderful life. But then in 1995, I met some people here in British Columbia. And they handed me a book. This one lady handed me a book. And when I was going south that year, and so she said, "You might like to read this book." And I love to read. And the book was called Bones of Contention. And it was about evolution. I came back the next summer, and she said, "Did you read the book?" And I says, "You're not going to talk to me into anything." That was all it was said. The next year, she handed me a book again. It was called Creation Science. I came back again, and she said, "Did you read the book?" And I said, "Yeah, but there's a lot of nonsense in there." So she asked me, "Do you want to go to a creation science meeting?" And it was in White Rock. So I went to the meeting. And I came home and I said to my wife, "I'm never going to one of those things again. Those stupid people started with prayers, and then they were talking about Jesus and the Bible and so on." I said, "That's a bunch of nonsense." I mean, a month later she said, "Would you like to go to another meeting?" And I said, "Okay." I had to question, what am I went to the meeting, and I came home and said, "Never again. No, just no way." I was asked a third time, and I said, "Okay." God was working in my life, no question. It took me 7 years from that first book until I accepted Christ. May the 1st of 2001, I accepted Christ as my Lord and Savior. But I spent 7 years, very slowly starting, and then I went more and more, trying to study and find out what was going on. As I said here, I'm looking for the truth. I want the truth. And finally, I came to the realization that all this evolutionary stuff and things that we hear on TV and that we read in National Geographic and all this nonsense we get in school is garbage. And I said, hey, maybe there's something in the Bible. And I started reading Genesis. And then I did come to Christ. So, what I'm going to do in the next few weeks is to go over very briefly some highlights about evolution and creation. I want to be able to shed some light into the darkness that's in the world anytime I have an opportunity. All right, first thing we're going to do is get started. Woo. I have to get my notes up here. All right, so when we talk about creation science, we have three things we can look at. We have biblical creation. Biblical creation is based in the Bible only. It is not truly scientific. It is based in Genesis 1. All right? What happened? There it is. Okay, secondly, we have creation science, which is true science, which is looking at how the earth was created, how it came about. Know why?
Just slow.
We're going to try something different. Try that. Okay, the third thing is evolutionary science. And in evolution science, they're looking at exactly the same things that we do when we look at creation science. We have exactly the same things, but we have different suppositions, as we'll see in a couple of minutes here as we get going. So here's the question for you. Why should we consider creation science? Why don't we just sit back and accept evolution science? There's a big problem with the science of evolution. Lots of problems with it. Now, what are the problems? First of all, nothing is evolving at present. Absolutely nothing. No one has ever seen anything evolve. What we're talking about is one species becoming another species. Never has happened. We have no new species anywhere in the world of any sort. There is no mechanism, no known mechanism for how evolution can occur. It's just an idea. We have no fossil evidence. We will be talking about fossils next week. And there's no evidence that points to evolution as stepping up and through different things. When we have fossils, the idea for evolution is that when something dies, it's on the bottom and it gets buried. And then there's more dirt and so on fills it, and then later on something else dies and it's going to be in the ground above it. And so these fossils would show evolution as we come through them. But they're all mixed up. Sometimes we have modern humans down below things that supposedly became extinct a billion years ago. So the fossils don't give us any clue to that. There is no evidence anywhere that evolution is even possible. There's no way. And the more we have scientific knowledge with DNA and so on, and we'll talk about that later today, there's no way that any of that is going to be possible. You'll see that as we get going. Similarities. We say we're coming from monkeys. Why do people say that we come from monkeys? The main reason is because monkeys have an opposable thumb, as we do. Only chimpanzees, apes, and so on have an opposable thumb. But here's a question. Let me throw you this out. What animal has a lung closest to ours? Anybody have an idea? A pig. Right? We always get heart valves and so on. That's from the pigs. But the lungs are almost the same as humans. What eye in the world? The eyeball. What animal has an eyeball most like a human? An octopus. Right? So we start looking at these things and there's no similarities. It's only this one thing, the opposable thumb, that people talk about as coming from monkeys. Vestigial organs. Does anybody know what your appendix is good for? You are wrong. They have discovered that the appendix is very useful If you have depressed immune system, your appendix takes over and gives you immunity in many things. They do not take appendices out now the way they used to in the past. They thought it was an organ that was left over from some other animal that we're stuck with, and so it's not useful. What about the tonsils? The tonsils are absolutely crucial in the gestation period, in the 9 months when a person's in the womb. After they're born, it's useless. But it's very useful. It has to be there in that gestation period. In the 1800s, they thought there was something like 250 vestigial organs in the body. They didn't know what they were for, and they said these are just leftover things. The tailbone, they say that's just left over from the tail of a monkey. If you didn't have a tailbone, you could not walk, you couldn't stand upright. Your muscles are totally based in holding all that together. As of today, I believe there's only 1, maybe 2 items that are still called vestigial that they haven't totally found out what they're useful for. There's no such thing as a vestigial organ. Every organ that we have in our body was put there by God for a purpose.
That's right.
All right, so the question is, what evidence is there for evolution?
Nothing.
1985, a geneticist at Harvard, Richard Lewontin, get what he said. He says, no one has ever found an organism that is known not to have parents or a parent. This is the strongest evidence on behalf of evolution. What's that mean? Is there anybody who never had parents? Yes, Adam and Eve, they didn't have parents, right? They can't find Adam and Eve, they can't find any other animal. All of the animals that God created in the day 5 and day 6, they were without parents. God created them. But they can't find those people, so therefore they say that means that everybody had to have a parent, so therefore evolution is the only way it comes about. They basically do not want God in their life. It's as ridiculous as it sounds. I've mentioned science several times. So the question here is, what is science? For those of you that are in school, this might be eye-opening. First of all, you have to be able to observe something in order to have science. If you can't see it, there is no science. Secondly, whatever it is, you must be able to test it. If you can't test it, it's not scientific. And thirdly, whatever you test, you have to be able to repeat the test. It has to be repeatable. So if a scientist comes up and does a test on something, somebody on the other side of the world is going to try it to make sure that you're telling the truth. And that happens among scientists all the time. It's always being done that way. Science must have 3 things: observable, testable, and repeatable. So let's talk briefly about some of the scientific concepts that we have. A hypothesis. A hypothesis is an idea only. That's all it is. It's an idea. You have to forgive me, I gotta flip a couple of notes to catch up again. So, it's a statement that can be tested scientifically, whatever it happens to be. Oh, thank you. So, for example, let's just consider what causes wind. I'm going to say wind is caused by the trees moving their branches. Well, it's true. Every time there's wind, the trees are moving their branches. So if the trees don't move their branches, it's an idea. Can we test it? You're darn right we can test it. And guess what? It's false. That idea, that hypothesis doesn't work. So what we do is we change the hypothesis and try something else. Now, we come up with a theory. We come up with a theory that says, for example, there's pressure differences around the world. And if we have a high pressure here and a low pressure over here, air is going to move, making wind. Can we test it? Sure we can. We can test it in all kinds of ways. We can measure the pressure in different places and we can see the wind. We can see the wind moving. That becomes a theory now, right? We can test it, but we have not proven it. You cannot prove it. You cannot prove anything. All you can do is test it. But we get a scientific law. For example, you do something so many times, it's obvious you're never going to find an error. If you throw something up in the air, where's it going? It's going to come back down. Every single time. So we have a law of gravity. It's never been proven, but it is so certain that it's coming back down, that we call it a law, all right? There's never been an example that it has not worked. Now, once we do that, we have a thing called models. We have a model that tells us these various things, and with the model, we make predictions. Now, the Big Bang Theory, right, it's a theory, it's not a law, it's a theory, but they have a model for it. And the model tells them different things. And so what they do is they calculate how to get to the moon, how to get to Mars, how to send a spacecraft to Pluto. They can do that using the models that they have created about astronomy. But back several hundred years ago, before, well, actually I shouldn't say that, back just over half a century ago, they used the Copernican model of astrophysics. It was so complex, the Big Bang was simpler, but now the Big Bang Theory has become so complex. I talked to one astrophysicist a year and a half ago, and he said we could almost go back to the Copernican theory, which was 400 years old, and do better than we can with this thing now. So they're having to find new models now. They're having to look at different things with that. So we're going to look at scientific evidence. First of all, we have empirical. Empirical is something that we can literally see. We can throw a ball up in the air and it comes back down. That's evidence, right? That's empirical evidence. You're actually doing something and you can see what happens. We have origins or historical. You can't see it. We cannot see the creation of the world. We can't see the creation of men. We can't see evolution. We can't see any of these things. We cannot see that Louis Riel was a rebel in Canada. We've only got books, we've got information. We cannot prove, except through books, that Brian Mulroney was the Prime Minister of Canada, right? These are all historical things. That's evidence, but we have to only take it on faith or on writing things. Theoretical. There are many things that are theoretical and they're mathematical in concept. There's all kinds of things. You hear things about string theory and so on. These are mathematical concepts that try to show different things to make up a test. So, we have models. We're talking about evolution. And so what does the evolution model tell us? It says 15 billion years ago there was a Big Bang. There was a basketball of everything. It blew up and it went out in all directions. And from that, we have everything that exists in the entire universe today. 4.6 billion years ago, our solar system formed, according to their model. 3.5 billion years ago, somehow, chemicals came together and made a cell. They made life. And believe me, we're not going to even get into that, because if we start into that, that takes weeks and weeks and massive studies to get into that. That's an absolute impossibility. It's like saying, pick up the dirt. How many people here believe that if you kiss a frog, it could turn into a prince? Anybody believe it? If you believe in evolution, that's what you believe in. You believe that that frog becomes a prince, right? It's that ridiculous. But anyway. They say the first cell grew and developed and became more complex. So we had a single cell like a bacteria, and it became a cell of something else, and it grew into something else, and it becomes grass, and it becomes trees, and it becomes fish, and it becomes toads, and it becomes monkeys and people. So it just keeps on growing. So the complex life forms that were there in the oceans became fish and then animals. They say that fish came out and became animals. The animals, especially reptiles, became birds as a theory. And then the animals, which were ape-like, eventually came to humans. So that's basically, in a sum, the theory of evolution. Very quick. The creation model. That's what I believe in. But I'm going to show you as we're going through various things and why. It says 6,000 years ago. The Bible points out, and you can go through the Bible, and it does come up to 6,000 years. It says on day 1, God created the heaven and the earth. Then it says on day 2, he had a firmament that separated the waters. Then on day 3, he had made dry land, he made the seas, and he made vegetation on the earth. On day 4, he created the sun, the moon, and the stars. But remember, on day 1, there was light. And everybody says, well, how can there be light? There was no sun, no nothing. There was no moon to reflect it. The light that was there was God. It was a Shekinah glory. It was God's face that was overseeing the whole thing. that light permeated the entire universe 3 days before he even created the sun. As you get into studying biblically, you can start looking at all these things. And then on day 5, he created fish and birds. On day 6, he created land animals and humans. And then 1,656 years later, after the creation, that number is in the Bible. You have to add up the numbers that are in Genesis 5, I think it is. Anyway, there was a worldwide flood. And there was an ark that carried 8 people and 2 of each kind of animal. Now, if anybody's interested in this particular thing, back in Kentucky, right now, it opened, I think, last weekend. There is it's called the Ark Experience. They have built a full-size ark that is based on the Bible. It's 550 feet long, and it's a full-size. And I've read several textbooks on this. There are huge textbooks that show you that only half of that ship would be used in carrying all the animals of the world that are there. Now people say, well, how is he going to carry a T-Rex? And how is he going to carry an elephant and a giraffe? I mean, and every time you see these kids' things in a nursery, they always show a giraffe standing out the top. That's a lie. God, first of all, sent the animals to the ark, and he doesn't send the old people. All of these animals grow up into big animals, whether they're dinosaurs or whether they're giraffes. God would send the young ones, and he could put them into a sleep. They basically would sleep for most of the, I think it's 9 months that they were on the ark. So, in that time, they were small animals. And then when they came off as small animals and started growing from there. And as you start getting into this, I mean, dinosaurs were on the ark, no questions. But then there's a huge story when you get into that. We're going to talk about dinosaurs a little bit next week, I think it is. But anyway, we'll get to that later. So, evolution and creation are both historical science. We cannot go back, we cannot see it, we can't test it, we can't repeat it. It's done and it's over. So, it's historical science. You can't see them, nothing can be done for testing them. Both of them are based on faith in a belief. You have to believe one way or the other. You either believe that there is a God that created it, or you have to believe that this came about. If you start looking at mathematical probabilities and statistics, which I spent a long time looking at, to be an evolutionist, you have to have more faith than anybody who believes in God.
That's right.
I mean, it's an absolute impossibility. And as we go on further, I'll point out different things where scientists and different people have said things. So, the question for us to answer today, does the evolution model or does the creation model have a more reasonable faith? That's really what we have to consider. Which is more reasonable? Did God create everything, or did it just come about by chance? So, as we go through this series, we're going to look at 4 things. Today, for the rest of my time, we're going to look at biology. Very quickly, very simply. I'm not a biologist, so I have to stretch that. Next week, we're going to look at fossils and dinosaurs. Then we're going to consider the age of the earth. And finally, in the last week, we're going to look at biblical evolutionary ideas. There are many preachers, there are many Christians who believe in evolution. I'm going to be looking at that, comparing it to the Bible. What does the Bible say, and how does that fit into all of these things? So, as of now, we are going to start looking at biology. And as I said, I'm no expert in biology. I know a lot more about some of the other things in biology, so you have to bear with me. And if I say something wrong, don't be afraid to correct me after. All right, we have 2 models, an evolution model and a creation model. The evolution model says natural processes and chemical reactions can bring living organisms into existence and make them more complex. That's what it says. Natural processes and chemical reaction. Nobody can do it. Nobody's ever tried it. I just thought of another joke. If I may, I'll throw another joke in here. One scientist comes to another, and he comes to God and says, "Hey God, we don't need you anymore. We have now created life." "Oh, really?" He says, "Okay, let's see." So he reaches down and he picks up some dirt. And God says, "Oh, no, get your own dirt. Where'd you get that? That's mine." And so, the thing is, God created everything. But how do you make life? So, The creation model says living organisms came into being fully functional at the time of creation and are being maintained as such now. Now let's go on and just compare this in a pictorial sense. Evolution believes in a common ancestor. There was one cell that formed, and then it blew up from there. So as you put it together, there's a common ancestor, whether it was a bacteria or a cell or whatever it was. But from that, it's a tree, and they start growing up. And so from that one thing, we get dogs, we get horses, we get cats. We get all of these different things that are there out of a tree. And there's all different branches in those things. And don't forget, trees and grass and plants and flowers and everything had to grow out of that one cell, right, in order for this to work. The creation believes in a common designer, not a common ancestor. It's a common designer. So, when God created, He created very simple organisms. He created an original dog. He created an original horse, an original cat, and He created the first humans. Now, when we say the original dog, He didn't create poodles and chihuahuas and shih tzus and border collies and everything. He didn't create all that. He created one dog that had all of these characteristics. The wolf, the coyote, and all of our domestic dogs are all of the same thing. How do you know? And the Bible says He created it by kind. They went to the ark by kind. How do you know what a kind is? A kind is when you can take and breed these two things together. You can breed a Great Dane with a Chihuahua, right? The only problem is, do not try to put the Great Dane sperm into a Chihuahua. It'll kill the Chihuahua, right? And so you can only do certain ways. Here's another question. Does anybody know what a mule is?
Yeah.
A mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey, but it never procreates. It cannot procreate. A mule is only created when you put a horse and a donkey together, and you can only take the donkey sperm and put it into the horse. When they've tried the other way, it kills the donkey, because the horse is too much bigger than a donkey. So it only goes one way, all right? So that's how you define a kind. A zebra will mate with a horse. That's part of the horse family. And you can go through all of these things in that type of a situation. All right, now let's start looking at some of these biological basics. We have chromosomes. Everybody talks about these different things. And again, as I said, I'm very weak in a lot of this stuff. But we have chromosomes, and it's made of DNA. Every human has 46 chromosomes. There's 23 pairs. And every different species on the earth has a different number. But humans have 23 pairs. We get 23 from the mother and 23 from the father. Right? That's how we come together. Now, these genes in our cells, or rather the chromosomes, have genes. And we all hear about these different things. What color are your eyes? Well, that's determined by your genes. What color is your hair? Like bald is beautiful. That's in the genes, right? So, but the genes are short segments of DNA, and they give you specific characteristics. Incidentally, can I throw this one out too? Do you know why God made bald heads? Why He made hair? He had to put hair on the mistakes. Okay. So the chromosomes are mostly made of DNA. Whoops, sorry. Now, the genes that we've got down here, these genes that are in there, some of them are dominant. They're very characteristic, and they will always show up. Other ones are recessive. They're hidden. They're very weak. So they do not occur very often. I'm going to show you some examples of this. We're going to look at biological change. So, to make a change in a body, there's an interaction of these genes with the environment, and different things happen. Has anybody heard of sun-red corn?
Yes.
Do you know how to get sun-red corn? Sun-red corn is yellow, except when it's still on the stalk. If you peel the husk down and leave it exposed to the sun, the corn turns red. The environment affects that, the genes in there, and it turns it red. If you leave the husk on that thing, it will still come out as yellow corn. So the environment will affect corn in that sense, certain kinds. A peppered moth. We're going to look at this later. In the Industrial Revolution in England, evolutionists use this as a sign of evolution, which we'll get to later. But Before the Industrial Revolution in England, which would be back in the 1600s, peppered moths were almost white. You're going to see pictures. And so they blended in with everything that was there. But in the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, when everything became all this smoke and the soot, everything became very dark. So all of these white moths, peppered moths, that would land on a piece of bark or a stone, they stood out. And of course the birds would come along and grab them and eat them. But some of them had dark, they became dark. And so very quickly, because of that environment, all of the peppered moths became very dark. And so now they were hidden amongst the soot that was all over England. Any white ones that formed were chewed up by other birds very quickly. So a second way here now is genetic recombination. When we put these chromosomes together, these pairs, they can come together. Remember we said some are dominant and some are recessive. These people, Benjamin and Angela Hidborough, are from Nigeria, and they're living today in Britain, right? This is their family. They're from Nigeria. DNA has been tested. The child, it's a white child. It's their child. It was a recessive gene, and this has happened in several cases in the last, 40, 50 years. But that's their family, totally. It's all DNA is all proven. So it's a genetic recombination. There was a recessive gene that got in there. Whether there was somewhere in their past, there might have been something with, white, or whatever it happened to be. And it came up in this marriage. Now, thirdly, we have genetic mutations. Everybody talks about mutants. We all hear about what they call those turtle guys on the TV. They're all whatever, you get Spider-Man, he's a genetic mutation. All these weird characters, they always talk about genetic mutations. The genes that we have in our body are very, very, very stable. And there's very few natural mutations. Mutations in almost every case are mostly harmful. They mostly involve a loss of function or death before the birth. So, mutations are generally bad. There is a beneficial mutation, sickle cell anemia. Anybody heard of it? Sure. Carriers of sickle cell anemia cannot contract malaria, but 25% of the children carriers die. But they can never contract malaria. So they've got a 75% chance of surviving childhood and never contracting malaria. Is it a good one? You'd have to make an individual choice and decision on that. Okay, microevolution. We're going to call two different kinds of evolution here. These are terms that are used by both creationists and evolutionists. Microevolution is micro, it's very small, minor changes to a species. Bird beaks. Everybody heard of Darwin, who went to the Galapagos Islands, and he found finches. And on different islands, they had different kinds of beaks. And he said, that's evolution. The difference is that on the one island, they had insects. And so they have a very tiny, very sharp beak. That's all. So they could get these insects. But on the next island, they had no insects, and all they had was nuts and, corn and whatever else was on the island. And so they had to have a very hard, thick beak to be able to break these things open to get at the nutrition that was inside. They're still finches, and they will interbreed. They just have a different beak. That's a micro change. Dog kinds. A poodle, well, if you want to call a poodle a dog, but anyway. Chihuahuas and everything else. They're all different kinds, right? They're micro changes. Is there anybody here who would not recognize any kind of a dog when you saw one? Everybody everywhere in the world will recognize a dog or a cat. The peppered moth I just talked about, going from light to dark. That's a micro change. That's not evolution. We call it microevolution because they had to get darker in England if they were going to survive as a species, because the white on the dark background with the soot, they were all being eaten up. So there's a microevolution, but if everything cleans up, they're all going to go back to being white so they can hide themselves. Macroevolution. There's major changes to a species that result in a new species. Has anybody ever seen a dog turn into a cat? How about a fish turning into a bird? That's a new species. And it doesn't happen. It has never ever been seen to happen. All right. Darwin talked about evolution by natural selection. He said, given enough time, that nature will select those traits or adaptations that are best suited for a specific environment. The peppered moth, right? That's what it is. It's a natural selection. The white ones got eaten up when the ground became sooty, the dark ones survived. And the same thing with the finches. Those finches that were outfitted for eating insects died on the island where they couldn't get at the seeds. So, it's a natural selection, but it's still in the characteristic. All right, so these cases are here that evolutionists use to imply this microevolution. The peppered moth again. They keep saying, well, that's evolution. It changes to that. I'm not going to belabor that. Oh, here's the pictures. That's one. This is a peppered moth. Everybody see it? This is a peppered moth, the dark ones on a clean background. So over here, you can obviously see them there, up here. But there's the moth right here. There's the wing up here, and there's the head, the wing down in here, right? When it's clean. And now, through these microevolution, as it got sooty, that's what they look like. And the birds would go straight to that one. So what happened is, the peppered moths all became dark over here, right? There's less chance of it. That doesn't prove evolution by natural selection or anything else. It's still a peppered moth, any way you look at it. The finch, I've already talked about that briefly. Again, this is just showing the beaks. The ones up at the top are the ones that go after seeds and nuts and so on. The ones in the bottom are the ones that are going after insects and worms and whatever else. They have a different beak, but they're still finches. Any way you look at them, they're still finches. No evolution. Now, we always get this bacterial thing. Every year, everybody's got to get a flu shot. They say if last year's flu shot doesn't work because it's evolved to give you better resistance. You know, the bacteria is evolved. It hasn't evolved. Bacteria, this is where I get very sketchy in these things, but I'm going to try to explain it. Most commonly, bacteria's resistance to antibiotics arises through defects that causes the inactivation of genes which control transport through the cell. So, a bacteria is a cell. And it has in there a feature that allows it to take in. It attacks everything as a bacteria. And so if it attacks this antibiotic, if it goes after it, then it's going to kill it. Well, what happens is it now shuts down that gene. So that in the future, when it sees that antibiotic, it doesn't go after it. It doesn't grab it. It just lets it go. That's not evolution. It's actually a loss of information. There's less and less information. So, as we look at these things, evolution says there's a common ancestor, right? Creation says there's a common designer. It's not a single cell becoming people. It's not a frog to a prince. It's God. God's a designer. As a designer, let me come back on this just briefly. How many of you know that a dog has a foot, an ankle, a lower leg, a knee, and an upper leg bone, right? The foot is actually up in there. He's on his toes. The dog's always on his toes. So the foot is actually up in the air. The ankle is that back part, and then it comes up, and there's a knee joint, and then back up to the hip. So it's a different thing, but it has the same joints. Their forearms are the same as humans. If we look at all these different creatures, it's the same as, it's a designer. Look at a car. What do cars all have? 4 wheels. Most of them run on gas or electric. They have a steering wheel. They have a couple of seats. They have windows. There's a common design in this thing. It's not a single one. They didn't all evolve. They didn't come about from that. Airplanes. Airplanes have to have wings. Well, actually, they try to build airplanes that are flying bodies. So anyway, there's a common design to these things. So, changes in the living things happen because of a combination of genes, as we see with that one fellow, the couple from Nigeria, or we can see the environment acting on an organism, like the sun-red corn, exposing it to the sun, changes it. And so there's changes in these living things. But mutations are very rare. Generally harmful, they cause death or deformities, they're wiped out quickly in a population. Let's look at this. If we have two islands, with one island has a huge population of something, and it develops a mutation, one of these animals, a newborn has a mutation, and it's a good mutation. It now mates with somebody else on the island. What are the chances that that mutation is going to get carried over with the next one? It's a mutation which is very rare in the first place. That next one will wipe out that first mutation, for the most part. If you take an island that has a small population, the chances of ever getting a mutation are very, very slim. Almost never going to happen. So, to get a mutation is very, very rare. I've got notes somewhere down here which I'm having a problem reading, so I'm going from the memory here. There are mutations in every new cell that's created in your body. It works out that when a cell is created, a new cell, there is a mutation formed that's equivalent to making one typing error in 5 pages. All right? Can you type 5 pages with only one error? But that's the way your cells work. But the cells have a proofreading system that turns around and makes corrections. It will correct every mistake that it makes. And by the time it's corrected those that get through, there is one error, one typing error for 50 million pages of typing. That's the final resolution. So if you want to talk about mutations, they're extremely rare, very rare to ever get through. Now, okay, microevolution does happen. We get microevolution. We get dogs changing. We breed dogs to do certain things. I have Cairn Terriers, and they have a tail that's like a chain. They dig holes. They love to go into holes, and you can literally grab their tail and pull them out. They have a very, very strong tail. So people develop animals now. They breed animals to have characteristics. And it does happen all the time, whether it's in cats or whatever. Macroevolution, changing from one species to another, has never, ever been observed. Never. Natural selection is not a macroevolution. It does not make this change. I've got another example here I can use. Somebody runs a mile in 10 minutes, right? Or maybe I should be putting this into kilometers. Somebody runs a kilometer in 10 minutes. A year later, they run a kilometer in 8 minutes. A year later, they run it in 6 minutes. Does that mean that by the time they get there that they'll be able to run a kilometer in a minute? Or 30 seconds? No. No. There's limits to all of these kind of things. You cannot take something that's changing and extrapolate it forever. And it's the same thing when you take these natural selection things. You cannot extrapolate these. Just because a moth changes from light color to dark color doesn't mean that it's going to change into a hawk. It's not going to change into a big bird. It doesn't happen. Now, I've got a couple other examples. I love these stories. A woodpecker. Evolution for a woodpecker. A bird flies up to a tree to get an insect, and guess what? It's going to die because it has no way to hang onto the tree. So, it's got to evolve claws. Everything I'm telling you is absolutely true about a woodpecker. It blew my mind when I first heard this. The woodpecker has to have claws that he can grab into the tree. So, now he's got claws, he comes back to the tree, and he's going to die. Because as soon as he claws on there, he falls over backwards, right? Now he's got to evolve feathers that are really super strong that he pushes against a tree and it keeps him upright. So now he's got tail feathers. He flies up to the tree. Guess what? He's going to die. Because first thing he does is he smashes his head into the thing, and the first thing that happens is his beak smashes right through his skull, right? He's dead. So now he develops this hardened, actually he develops a hardened beak first, because the first time it just breaks. The second time, he has to harden the skull so it doesn't go through the skull, right? So he's got to have a hardened skull and a beak. Now he gets up there and he smashes his head in, and guess what? He's going to die. A woodpecker hits the tree so hard that his eyes would pop out of his eye, or would pop right out of his sockets. Absolutely no ifs, ands, or buts in that. So what happens is he has to develop this thing that, and you know how a woodpecker goes back and forth. Every time his head comes back, he opens his eyes, focuses where he's going, closes the eyes, and then smashes into the tree. Every single time he has to open and close his eyelids, every time he hits. That's the only way his eyes stay there. So now, he finally gets a hole in the tree, and guess what? He's going to die. That insect isn't stupid. He hears this guy knocking on his door out there, and he moves away. So he's got to get a long tongue, right? So he gets this long tongue, and he comes up, gets a hole, and he's got a long tongue. Well, guess what? He's going to die because he can't hang on to the insect. So what happens is now he's got to develop a glue in his tongue. So now there's a glue that he gets in there, and he sticks onto this insect. And he pulls it back out, well, guess what? Now, he's going to die because he has no way, he's got this long tongue, flying over his tongue hanging out. He's going to step on it. So the next thing is now he's got to develop a glue that takes care of the glue, that dissolves the glue. So now he's got to dissolve this glue so that he can get the thing. But he's still got a problem because he's got this long tongue hanging out when he's flying around. So the woodpecker's tongue is actually attached to his spine in the back. The tongue comes up over the top of the head, and it actually exposes itself over the beak and then back into the beak and comes out. And so every time he pulls it back, it's actually working back in his spine on his back. It's like a Venetian blind. You pull it down, snap it back up. Any one of those things missing, that bird can't survive. It's absolutely impossible. And when I first heard that, I said, that can't be true. But I've researched it, and it's absolutely true, every bit of that. A woodpecker is an amazing creation, and if it's not all there, it is never going to evolve. It can't survive. Simple enough. An ape to a man. They always say, well, apes have 96% the same DNA as humans. It's only 4%. Guess what? Bananas have 50% the same as human DNA. So you're half banana, whether you know it or not. Right? Well, I might be bananas anyway. But if we took that 96% of the DNA that's the same in the ape as a human, and if we made one perfect change every generation, so basically every 20 years, if we had a perfect change, and we had to go through that 4%, there isn't enough time in the history of the world from 4.6 billion years ago to reach man yet. That's how many changes have to happen. And that's if you get a one change every 20 years, it's perfect. And remember, mutations and changes in these things are extremely rare. Now, here's the question. If I took a watch and took all the parts and threw them in a paper bag, and if I stand here and start shaking the bag, how long do I have to shake the bag until that watch puts itself back together? Can it happen? Well, guess what? That's what evolution is trying to do. They're trying to say we take all these little bits and pieces and dirt and so on and slime, and all of a sudden it becomes humans. Here's another example. Take a Boeing 747. Everybody knows what that is. Take every single piece that's in the plane. There's millions of pieces. And put them out in a field in Nebraska or Iowa. Right? And then have a tornado come through and let it sit there for as long as it wants, churning that up. How long is it going to take before that tornado makes a fully flyable Boeing 747? That's never going to happen. It can't happen. Yet, they're saying that does happen with a human cell. A single human cell is more complex than a Boeing 747. Anything that God has created is more complex than anything man's ever done. And yet we say that it's impossible for these things to happen, but it's quite possible to take these other things. So, a watch in a bag, a Boeing 747. So, out of all this information, why is any of this important all the time? Evolution is trying to say there is no God. There is no God. That's all it's trying to do. Later on in other classes, we'll talk about what some professors say. Evolution has been considered throughout all of recorded history. It's never changed. You can go back into the Bible and Nimrod back in there. He was into this evolutionary thing. There's all kinds of things as you get into the stories from back in the Old Testament. And it's all based in this evolution. Now, there's only two possible choices for origins of life, right? What are the choices? Anybody know? Come on, what are we talking about?
Big Bang.
Evolution or creation. That's it. There's nothing else. Creation by a supreme deity or evolution by chance. There's nothing else. If anybody else can think of any other way that life could come about, you are just going to become a billionaire overnight. There's no other way. Nobody's ever thought of another way. But if you can think of another way, right, then you will become a billionaire overnight. Evolution came about only because men did not want to believe in or be holding to a God. They just don't want to have anything to do with God. If men can find any way for life to have been created without a supreme deity, they can ignore and forget about God. That's the whole purpose. So they're saying that we evolved from monkeys. The monkeys came from something else, and they came from something else, and so on. Next week, when we get into fossils and dinosaurs, we will be talking about a lot of these things and what happens with those. First thing we have to recognize is that every single person who's ever lived, I don't care if you're Billy Graham, I don't care if you're Justin Trudeau, and I don't care if you're me, every single person that's ever lived is a sinner. Except there's one person, right? But God cannot allow a sinner into his presence ever. God is so holy and so pure, you can never get to God's presence, ever, under any circumstances, with an exception. There's nothing we can do on our own. God's wrath will come down on you when the time comes. Absolutely it will. But he provided a way for us to be saved. He's always given us a way out. He sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to the earth. Now, when Christ was on the cross, right, when he was going through that, he suffered every single punishment that men deserve. When you go through the Old Testament of the Bible, you have to go through the Jewish encyclopedias and all of the Jewish laws and so on along with the Bible. But there's a punishment for every single thing that you do wrong. If you stole something from your neighbor, there would be punishment. It might be just repaying him sevenfold. But if you killed his animal, and you couldn't repay it, it might mean that you would get 2 lashes or something. There would be a punishment, and it's spelled all the way out. In the Bible and in the Old Testament times, they believed that if you took 40 strokes with a whip from a lash, that would kill a person. 39 was the limit that they could go to. That would leave a person just hanging on by a thread. But there's a punishment for everything. When Christ went to the cross, when he was at that final point, they did everything. They spit on him, they beat him up, they punched him. It's all punishment. Then they lashed him. And then the ultimate was they hung him on a cross. These were all physical punishments that he suffered. And it's for every single sin that you've ever created. Whether you stole a yo-yo string like I did when I was 5 years old from a store and had to go back and apologize and pay for it. Or if you murdered somebody, there is a punishment, a physical punishment. Christ suffered every single physical punishment that you deserve. But then when he was on the cross, hanging there, he took God's wrath. God poured his anger out for all of us, for everything we've done. He poured it onto Christ. And when Christ died, he gave us his righteousness, because he was the only person who was sinless, absolutely sinless. All we have to do is to believe in Christ. You've got to actually believe this wholeheartedly, and you've got to do your best to try to follow his commandments. There's not one person in this room or anywhere in the world that can be a perfect Christian. You can't do it. Nobody can. You will always fail, but you are trying all the time. As you recognize sin, you try to get them out of your life. You make them to the point where they become something you don't want. You don't do them. You just keep trying. That's all you can do. So, evolution is trying to get you away from God. But God has turned around and said, I've created you, I've given you everything, and if you want salvation, you can have it in Jesus Christ. He's done everything that you need. So there is an absolute way for us to get salvation. So, next week, I'm going to talk about fossils and dinosaurs. Now, if anybody has any questions, I hope we didn't do too much overtime. If anybody has any questions, then we'll get the lights on and I can try to answer whatever questions you've got. Oh, and the other thing is too, if anybody wants, let me know. I can print all of these slides out with some of the notes that go with it. So just let me know after and I'll make up copies for next week, okay? So you can have these things. Well, just come up here and let me know, and I'll make sure I put a mark down here so I'll know how many copies to get, okay? So, thank you very much, but does anybody have any questions before we start?
You said there were dinosaurs on the park.
Yes.
Yeah, where's that?
What do you mean, where is that?
Well, where did you get that from, the dinosaurs?
The Bible.
The Bible.
The Bible.
I told you that.
The Bible says that 2 of every kind, male and female, of every kind of animal in the world came to the ark.
And fowl and animals and stuff.
Pardon?
It's just, I thought they died in the flood.
They did, but 2 of them, 2 of every species. There was 2 Tyrannosaurus Rex, there were 2 Stegosaurus, there were 2 Apatosaurus, but they would be small. They would just have been born, very small, right?
Yeah.
But there were, and then there's a whole story about how they died out after. And we'll get into that next week because we're talking about dinosaurs,
Yeah.
right? I'm not going to talk about the ark, but we will talk about why dinosaurs died out, right? And I'll also talk about the fact that there are dinosaurs living today.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, lizards and the.
No, I'm not talking lizards either. I'm talking all kinds of dinosaurs. And we'll go into those. We'll show you pictures. So you'll never get this stuff in National Geographic and all these things. Oh, let me just throw one other thing up too. 3 weeks ago, I found this magazine. It's a Smithsonian magazine. And it says, Discovering Our Ancestors. Researchers trace the human family back 7 million years. I sat down and I read this, and you know what? This thing is really good. It sounds so true. It does. They go ahead on the assumption that they're absolutely right. And they don't question. There's no questions raised. They say, this is the absolute truth. And when you read it, and I did that for years, until I started researching, and literally I have read some of the scientific reports, and it's astounding what you see that National Geographic and Smithsonian don't talk about when you get the actual report. We'll talk about that when we get to the age of the Earth. There's different things happening.
I have a question. A day is, years, but a day is but 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is but a day. Bible says that. So,
Peter, yeah.
yeah, so does that mean then that 1 year could be 1,000 years?
To God?
Or,
To God?
no, in our age, or in our, in our lifetime.
Well,
or
let's put it this way. The
our-
Bible, if you go back in time right now, in fact, the exact number is, I spent 2 years in researching all the dates that are in the Bible and all the times. And as of today, and there's a huge study, it takes a massive amount of stuff to do this, but as of today, I think it's 6,000, and the Earth is 6,042 years or something like that. But now, how many days did it take God to create the Earth? This is just one little comment, right? No, it took him 6, right? And then he says a day is like 1,000 years. A possibility exists. What everybody believes nowadays that the end is very close. It's imminent. Christ's return is imminent, right? That all of these things are happening. And I've done this. I've actually plotted out, I made a model, a scientific historical model. I took the days of creation, right, and what happened in each day, and related it to the physical Earth. And we actually have 6,000 years right now. And we had 6 days before God rested. And when is the rest? The rest is in the millennial reign. That's the 7th day, the same thing. So, nobody can explain it. Some people say, well, it means that 1 second could be 1,000 years. And so therefore, and we'll get into this in the 4th week when they start talking about all these things with, how people say, well, the Earth is billions of years old and evolution is true. God just erected it and these kind of things. There's no aspect of that at all. My only aspect of that one, the day is 1,000 years, is I relate it to the 6 days of creation and 6,000 years. And I can put
That's what
that
I'm
together.
saying. So it could have taken our much longer than 1 day to do each thing.
Oh, no, absolutely not.
Well, if the day is
Because
1,000 years, then.
that's another whole thing that we're going to get into
Yeah,
when we get to
that's
the
why
age
I'm
of the
asking
Earth.
the question, yeah.
It's been proven that Genesis 1, when it says 1 day, is actually 24 hours. There's no ifs, ands, or buts under the Hebrew, under the original Hebrew writing. And it's 99.96% absolutely certain that it's referring to 24 hours. And for every one of those things, there's a whole series of things that happen in every one of them. He tells you there's a morning and a night, right, on that day. Well, okay, there's a morning and a night, and so we went for 1 billion years, and we had sunlight, and then all of a sudden we had 1 billion years of darkness. Well, it doesn't work. The Earth rotates in every 24 hours. That's only one, right? But there's a whole series of those things. So no, when we get into that in the 4th week, we'll start looking at all of those times. Okay?
Later on, Darwin actually, he admitted that he couldn't explain how the eye could have ever evolved because the eye is so fantastic.
Yep.
If you study it.
Yep.
And he admitted that. And also in another book, Francis Crick, who was one of the fellows who discovered the DNA strand, he actually quoted from the Bible.
Really?
They're fearfully and wonderfully made. He quoted from the song.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
People tried to dispute the Bible, but in doing that, they proved it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's such a grand design of all of God's creations. It's just amazing.
Oh, I know. Okay. Thank you very much for now.
Thank you. That was it.
I'm going to be here for a while after. If you want to talk to me, we'll give it back to Dean, and then just let me know if you want a copy of these notes and so on, and we'll go from there. All right?
Okay.